Greetings, friends. It's me, Wayman, and this is a video on being born again. And since I've been reading all these books on psychology, analytical psychology, I came to a chapter on the separation from the state of paradise contained within the Ouroboros to begin the process of individuation, or becoming separated and becoming an individual. And the process happens in the psyche, and it also happens, I think, also, obviously, in our lives. One of the biggest mistakes that Christians have, and why Christianity, especially evangelicalism, is failing today, is because they fail to understand this process of individuation. And I think when they confuse it with born again being also being saved, they're two different things. Being born again does not mean that you're saved. It's kind of funny. Theologically, maybe it is, but psychologically, it's not. And I'll give some examples of what I mean. So, being saved, according to the Apostle Paul, and maybe John, and Johnian writings, meant that if you believed in the resurrection of Christ, you would be saved from damnation at his return, which they thought would be very short. And all of the New Testament writings that speak of church organization came later, because the early idea of Christianity was don't even get married, don't bother with worldly things, be separate from the world, because tomorrow you could be gone. You know, sell the farm, you don't need the equipment, kind of thing. But I think that the idea of that is much different than what Jesus was talking about with Nicodemus, because he asks, how can I go back into the womb and come out, when Jesus says, be born again? And what's interesting is, not that Jesus actually knew about this, but symbolically maybe he did, was re-entering the Ouroboros and restarting the process of individuation, coming out of, again, and realizing the self. I know it sounds kind of new agey, but let me explain what it means. It means going from being called out of a state of paradise, going through the conflict of becoming an individual, and then maybe being held on too long by the Ouroboros that will claim you. So an easy example would be, you know, these 30-year-old kids, their parents gave them everything, they're still in the basement playing video games, and, you know, finally one day, dad comes in and says, you're getting kicked out, get a job. You know, when they could have did it 10 or 12 years earlier on their own, they have to be pushed out. So it's kind of like the process of Abraham being called out from among his people to go into the great unknown. That was a part of the psyche that was becoming individuation, using Hebrew mythology and epic as symbolism for the psyche. Then they go into Egypt. It was a horrible state. Everything was given to them, but they had to work for it in a horrible state of transition. Another rebirthing process. They come out through the waters, and they go through this traumatic state of self-discovery through the desert. of wants and needs and self-discovery to reach the paradise idea of Israel and the promised land. So here we made, just like the Ouroboros, the serpent eating the tail, we made a full cycle of everything's perfect to becoming individualized through the process of individuation, and then back again to the promised Ouroboros, or the heavenly Jerusalem, or whatever that might be. Depends on what belief system you're in. It's symbolized many different ways. So I think that what now, don't get me wrong. Do I think Jesus really knew this? Probably not. Through symbolically, he may have. Although the writers may have placed those words in Jesus' mouth, simply to have him hobnobbing with top rebbes of the day, just like later they did with the Apostle Paul. And there were some writings that were forged, that were going back and forth with the Apostle Paul and some of the best of philosophers in Rome, which is very humorous to show, oh, look, Paul was thought very highly of, philosopher, blah, 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 So it could have been that too. But I think that the process of individuation is really what it means to be born again. And we go through this many different times in our lives. And it could be a horrible experience, like that of being taken against your will and swallowed, kind of like swallowed by death in the Baal epic. Or it could be a positive experience, a fair and foul experience of self-discovery. So kind of like Gilgamesh leaving the city, meeting Enkidu, and going on the journeys. His friend dies. He needs to find why his friend died, because he's so troubled by it. And he seeks out the only person who lived, Utnapishtim, who survived the flood. And he goes to the land of paradise, like heavenly-like land. And he sees Utnapishtim, laying with some lemonade underneath a tree. And he says to Utnapishtim, I thought you would be as a god, but you look like me. So that's pretty interesting. So he returns to that paradise to ask questions. Then he, as we know, loses the plant to the serpent in the waters, the cosmic waters, and he's forced to come back and die a death, which is interesting. Mot temu, you will die death, which is in Hebrew. So that's kind of interesting. So the whole thing of being rejected from the garden, of knowing opposites in the Hebrew story, that was a process of individuation started by the serpent, who facilitated the idea of becoming individualized. The flaming sword shown every way. They could not get back in. So the Ouroboros rejected them, in a sense, as some do, and they were forced to make it on their own through all the toils and suffering. And I think that such is life, and there's probably a whole bunch of outcomes and results of that that people deal with psychologically. So that's what I'm thinking of. You must be born again. You bet, but not in the way that is currently thought. Because today, being born again is so easy. I could go up to the Baptist church, bring a casserole and sign a card. What's that? It doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't transform my life. I haven't eaten anything. I haven't regurgitated anything. I haven't transformed anything in my life. And I hate saying this, but probably the Apostle Paul talked about this, being transformed and all that. Maybe he knew about this a little bit too, from the psychological standpoint. The Gnostics definitely knew about it. Upanishads, Hindus definitely knew about it. The Hopi Indians knew about it. So this whole transformation is symbolized in many different ways and in many different cultures. So friends, continue to be born again and again and again. I know I think it sounds kind of like a New Age reincarnation idea, but the process happens many times, and maybe you don't even know it unless it becomes overly joyful or overly painful. So I think a lot of these ecstatic moments, that people have, can come about through self-realization. However, I would say large portions of them are just based on emotion. After the emotion passes, you realize that maybe you aren't in the process of individuation, but are still in, and forced to be in, the Ouroboros, and you so badly would like to break out. But don't go to the New Age camp and get inside that little bag where you can't breathe, and then, you'll end up dead. Stay away from those. But work through it on your own terms, because you force it, it can be a very foul thing. You'll be swallowed alive. Take care, friends, and remember, everybody's thinking alike. Somebody isn't thinking